Good afternoon. Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain. And this afternoon, our special guest on Cool Your Heels with Lillian is Dr. Mamie Smith, who wrote a book called An American Story, My Family and Yours. So good afternoon, Mamie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, well, the bad day is turning into a fairly pleasant day.
Well,
so I'm real happy. I like nice days over cloudy, miserable, drizzly days.
Sure.
Whatever one can take. So please tell my audience, Mamie, a little bit background about you and then why you wrote a book the way you did.
Well, I was born in the Deep South, the state of Mississippi. Did part of my college there, and then moved on, married a military man, and traveled the world. But in the interim, I did education. When I married him, I only had 3 years of college, and part of that marriage agreement was that I'm going to put you through, get your degree. And so I went on to get not only my bachelor's in music education, vocal music education with a performing aspect of it, but I also got a master's in vocal music education as well as a doctorate in administration, and that was at Wayne State. Both of those last degrees were at Wayne State University in Michigan, and the bachelor's was when I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and I went to Austin Peay State University in Tennessee. I would drive there. It was only about 15 miles away, and I would finish my education there. So I went on to become a teacher, taught not only in Kentucky, that was my first place of teaching, but I taught everywhere my husband was stationed, who was a military man. And I ended up teaching on Okinawa, Japan, for the Air Force. I taught about 1,000 students vocal music, and then I also taught for the Navy in helping officers from 6 different countries perfect their English. They had all also learned the language in their countries, but it was with such an accent that the naval American officers and soldiers couldn't understand them. So part of my job, along with 2 other teachers, was to help them clear up that accent so that they could be understood. Then back to America, taught in California, performed as an opera singer in a little bit, not as a soloist, but in the chorus, but performed singing also when I was on Okinawa, Japan. I sang in naval churches around the island. And so I've done a little bit of that. I was never one to go on television and radio. Everything I did was live. And I'd like to just say to your audience that at my mature age now, I made my first CD. I never thought that would take place. And so I made a CD. I'm a classical singer. And so I made a CD called You Raise Me Up. I covered that song and with a classical version. And so that's kind of brings you up to where I am professionally. How did I get into writing? I got into writing in 2005. And it was a tragedy for me. It was one of the most difficult times in my life. My daughter and I were in business together. We had an upscale women and children's clothing store in downtown Detroit. And she contracted breast cancer, and she passed away in 2005. And that was devastating. No one knows how different it is to lose a child as opposed to another relative. I had lost my father, whom I was extremely close to. But grieving was totally different from losing my child. And so I was trying to work through that. And in working through that, there are many revelations that transpired at a spiritual basis that got me through that. And what happened in the interim was that I put my thoughts on paper as I was working through that. And my daughter's middle name was Rose. Her name was Mita Rose. And so the book I wrote is entitled The Unfolding of a Rose, and that's what got me into writing. And it just expresses thoughts that we as human beings have that unfold on a daily basis if we are astute at seeking that. And that produced 2 more books and 5 ebooks. And that's kind of where I am. The last book came out at the beginning of 2019, and it's An American Story, My Family and Yours.
But it's told from a totally different perspective than most books that have been written about African Americans tracing their ancestry back to when their ancestors were brought over as slaves.
Exactly.
And that's what makes the difference in your book.
Exactly. Because this book is a template using myself and my family to reveal the impact slavery has had on America, not just African Americans, but white Americans also. The book is not done with anger, bitterness, hatred. The book is done to reveal the deep-rooted thoughts that both sides have and have been carrying around for 250 years. And in an effort to say, this is how I believe healing can take place. Because as we know, we're still battling with those effects, that impact. And so I traced my family all the way back to 1840. And that was kind of difficult because I don't know if your audience knows the history of slavery, but slaves were considered property. And so they were recorded like property, like a cow or like a horse or whatever. And so that made it very difficult because sometimes they had a name that had no relation to anything, that didn't carry any weight. It only carried till they were sold to the next master who gave him another name. So that made it very difficult. But I was able to go back to 1840. I looked at census reports. I looked at word of mouth. I looked at historical records, birth certificates. All of those things contributed to my trying to discover my family. And I did go back and find my great-great-grandfather. And so that was what this book is all about, looking at what happened to them as much as I could, following it all the way up to my grandparents on both my paternal and maternal sides, and then trying to look at how their thinking was sent to my parents, which came down to me, which I transferred to my children, and I have a great-grandchild that's also being impacted by that. So this is what has happened in America for over 250 years with both blacks and whites, is that the generations of deeply embedded thoughts have been passed down, and from generation to generation. And the challenge is to look at those thoughts, examine them, and correct them.
And not let them fester.
Exactly. And so the book operates on the premise that we are what we believe. We are what we believe.
We are one race. Our ancestors all came out of Africa. I'm sorry, folks. That's the way it goes. Or if you're into religion, everybody came out from the Garden of Eden from two people, Adam and Eve. That's it. So whether you look at the monkeys coming down from the trees, coming out of Africa, or Adam and Eve when they came out in the Garden of Eden, everybody is their children.
I operate on a principle that you will find in the first chapter of Genesis, verse 127, and I pull out a little phrase, and it's a very important little phrase to me because to me it sets the foundation on everything for everything that I believe and try to live by day. And that phrase is that man is made in the image and the likeness of God. I'm going to repeat that. Man is made in the image and the likeness of God. And so when you think about an image, it's a replica of the person standing in front of something. If you stand in front of the mirror and you raise your hand, the image is going to do the same thing. And you shake your head, it's going to do the same thing. So let's transfer that knowledge to God, whom I believe is spirit, with a capital S. And so if you're standing in front of spirit and you are reflecting or you are the image of that, then whatever God is saying or thinking or is, I like to consider is, then that's what you're going to be. And that's my true identity of man. And it kind of differs from the one that many people believe. I kind of believe that the core of man is his spiritual foundation, which comes from God, spirit, soul, mind, principle, life, truth, love. All of those I have a capital L with, or capital S, or capital M for mind, for divine intelligence. So to me, if I am in the image and likeness of this mind or this spirit or this soul or this principle, then I'm going to reflect all of that, what that is. And I don't know how your audience might view God, but I view God as being totally good, knowing only totally good, totally right. And so then if I reflect that, and every man reflects that, then we have a world of goodness and righteousness. That's the concept that I believe Jesus was trying to teach. Humans have difficulty with that concept because we believe that we are the people who we think ourselves, our actions come from ourselves, and we create those as we move. That's why we have the problems that we have today. We need to go back to the core of what the essence of man is. And the foundation of man, I believe, is spiritual.
I agree. I agree. And I also believe very strongly that any behavior that man possesses, it's a spiritual behavior that they translate wrongly into a physical behavior. And that's where we have evil and disruption and war. But I believe that the spiritual behavior is what dictates how a person behaves within the core of their human relations.
Exactly. You said it so beautifully. Exactly. And when we deviate from the core of who we are, because when I teach children, I teach values also. I couldn't teach religion in the public school system, but I could teach values. If a kid hit another or stole his pencil or whatever, I would gather those two children that were involved in the incident, and I would say, did you take his pencil? And usually the kid would hang his head and say, yes, I did. And the question I would ask that child would be, would you like him to take your pencil? And I'd wait for an answer. And the kid would say, no. Well, then I'd say, well, why do you think he likes for you to take his pencil? I'm teaching do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a biblical concept. But I'm teaching it in a manner that a child can understand. And that is what I believe spirituality transcends itself to generations throughout the country and the world.
Yes, I know that when my son went to school, he was bullied because his skin was darker than everybody else's. So we lived in Texas, and I don't have to tell you how they treat people down there who have dark skin. And he came home bruised, and I said, you were in a fight. And he said, yeah. And I said, so what did you do? And he looked at me and says, I did exactly what you told me to do. I did not fight back. And he said, although it hurt, and the other kids laughed and sneered at me, I could tell that even though the kid who was pummeling me, he was more angry at himself for not producing the desired fear that he demanded than he was at me. He says, you're right. It has strength when you don't fight back. It really scares them, Mom. Why is that? They're the ones who are getting the upper hand. I said, only for a little while. I said, you know, if the world lived, the world has this saying, live by the sword, die by the sword, but we're not in that kind of culture anymore.
Absolutely. I like the fact that you're teaching your child to identify himself. And that's what he did. He said, I'm better than this kid.
Yes.
Yes, because I'm not going to allow him to interfere with my mental concept of who I am. And that's the problem with mankind today. We don't know who we are. And sometimes I lecture to audience on 3 questions. Who am I? Where am I going? And how am I going to get there? And those must be answered by each individual person. Nobody can answer those questions but that person. And then that person can do 2 things. They can lie to themselves, or they can answer it as honestly as they can. And when you answer it as honestly as you can and have a desire, if it's ugly that you say, if you see something ugly within yourself, and you identify that, you have a choice to change it. But if you never look at it, never examine it, you're going to go on, even though deep down within you, you know something is not right, but you don't want to face it. You run away from it. And that's what human nature does for a lot of us.
They rely on the fight and flight syndrome.
Exactly.
And instead of squaring off and facing their soul, which is part of their spirituality, they ignore that part and make excuses that for what they're doing, they are right. And then they invoke the Lord's name to become part of their serial lying.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons that having a deep understanding of who God is and knowing that you're made in that image and likeness of him will destroy those lies that we tell ourselves. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't make a lot of sense to some of the people who are listening, because they're going to say, Lillian, you're teaching religion. But I'm not teaching religion. If anything, I'm teaching about faith, belief, and spirituality. And there's a big difference.
Exactly. Religion is one thing, and I've gone through quite a few myself. I go from one to the other. There's a big difference between Catholics and being a Baptist, and that's what I grew up being. I married a Catholic. And so I learned those concepts. And, of course, I did a little Baha'ism. I read about that. So I've gone through a few myself. So religions to me are a set of beliefs that either one person or a whole bunch of people put together and said, this is what you should believe. And you can, and most of it has a spiritual basis to it. I'm not denying that. But that's why you have so many. That's why you have Baptists. That's why you have Methodists. That's why you have Catholics. That's why you have Muslims. You have all of these religions because they have deviated in some way. I'm not criticizing that. I'm explaining it. Okay?
And the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, if you take a look at their core, the core beliefs of all these religions, primarily when it comes to what they're saying, they're all saying the same thing. You just have to stay on what a gun person would say, on target.
Exactly. You are exactly right. And so what I try to do is wade through the similarities instead of the differences. But I say up front, I don't teach religion. I don't speak religion. I speak spirituality, and that comes from spirit. How do you define spirit?
To me, a spirit is that which dwells within the person. It's the unconscious, or I would say the semi-conscious, within each person that determines how that person is going to behave or find their place within society.
That's a good definition. I see it as outside of the human realm of thinking. I see it as a source that the human level of thought has to advance toward. And it's outside of that. I see it as a concept of goodness, a concept of respect, a concept of love. And that doesn't originate within the human realm of thinking. It originates within anyone's concept of God or Allah or
it's a concept of the universe, if you want to put it to put it plainly. And I guess the biggest one is the concept of responsibility and choice and what we give ourselves permission to do and not to do.
Exactly. And where does that come from? Where does that core come from? I'm going to take you back to my original thing of man made in the image and likeness of God. That's the core of every one of us. Every one of us has within our consciousness to reflect that image. Some of us exercise it more than others. But everybody has that. I said to someone I was having a conversation with, the worst person in the world that you can think of, and I'll tell you what the worst person that I think is in the world, the one who rapes little babies. I don't think there is any human being as despicable, no matter what they have done, because this is, to me, the little baby represents innocence and helplessness at that point.
And purity.
Exactly.
It's purity. It is the spiritual self in its pure state. So when it becomes soiled, the image shimmers or cracks apart.
Exactly. And a person who would invade that, to me, is despicable. But I say when I'm having the conversation, even that person has a spiritual core. And they said, you got to be kidding. I said, maybe that person doesn't recognize it, but it is there.
Or maybe he does not know what to do with it, or they're afraid of it.
Exactly. And he's piled on that core of element of thought because, again, I go back to, I think we are what we believe humanly. And so what we have to transform that thinking to a higher level of thinking. And when we do that, and then exercise it in our daily activities, because when you exercise it, knowing it and not doing it, to me, don't work. Because when you do it, that's where the spiritual growth comes from. And you have now, you've risen to a higher level. And so then the next time you're confronted with something, you are a little bit higher than you were the last time. So you can do better with whatever it is that is confronting you. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense.
Just think of it as Jacob's ladder to heaven.
Great.
And use it as one step or one rung at a time.
Exactly.
And you may fumble and go backwards, but you can always climb up. You can always go towards what I call the light.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't let the light in, you'll be shrouded in darkness.
Exactly. And so what I try to do with An American Story is to say, analyze yourself. If that's the theme with freedom of thought. Freedom of thought is the theme. There are two themes that run through that book: freedom of thought and spirituality, and looking at actually three, the inner self. So, but most of us don't ask ourselves why we do what we do. We don't do that. Why we feel toward others the way we feel toward them. We just ignore those little voices that say we should. And then another question we need to ask ourselves is that in line with the moral values that I really believe in? Is what I'm doing right now in line with the moral values that I believe in? And then you ask yourself, what are those values that I believe? And you answer as honestly as you can. And then when you do that, you look at, I cheated on my taxes, for an example. Then you ask yourself, is that in line with the moral values that I believe? And then answer honestly. If you answer, no, it's not, then that's the first step. Then you can change that if you wish. Right and wrong in this country seem to be closely aligned on opposite venues until recently.
Well, you gotta understand. I'm going to have to bring you back, Mamie. But I think the problem is there are a couple of things. One, to stand like the ancient Christians did and be mauled by lions or burned at the stake does not exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
People are not willing to lay down their lives or their spiritualness, if you want to put it that way. But more importantly, and my son pretty much defined it, he said, Mom, out of all my friends, Angela and I are the only ones who remain married and committed to our children. Everybody else has split. And the reason why we haven't left is because you told me that, A, we need to grow in the same direction, but B, more important, she said, anybody can put a notch in their belt, but it's the one single one that's the most important. You have made a covenant with your spouse, and no one but God can break that covenant. And ladies and gentlemen, I brought him up as an atheist, so go figure. But that's my moral values.
Yes.
And so, which have a bent to them with religion. I also brought him up by the Ten Commandments. Guess what? It worked, folks.
Yes.
He's an honest man, and his wife keeps on thanking me all the time.
That's great.
So, and she came out of a very highly organized religious family. So, but I think the precepts in which he was brought up with mirrored the same ones, the morals, that she was brought up with. So they both came from a good moral and spiritual background, and both are strong in that.
That is wonderful.
And that's what sustains them, and that's what the rest of the world needs to figure out how to do.
I agree wholeheartedly. I have a couple thought-provoking concepts I'd just like to throw out there, if you don't mind.
Sure, go right ahead.
One of them is, no person is better or worse than another. We are all governed by the thoughts held in consciousness. Concept number 2. One person's bondage affects the freedom of us all. Number 3. The experiences you have are based on the thoughts you hold. 4. Yourself is what you see in another self. And finally, self-denial imprisons the person denying. Look at those concepts. Figure out what they mean to you. I know what they mean to me, but that doesn't change what they mean to your listeners. Your listeners have to figure out what they mean to themselves and then act accordingly. And if I could just close with some words that I think are very wise.
Please go ahead. I just have one more concept to add to the bondage one.
Okay.
The bondage that you use on other people reflect back and bond you as well.
Exactly. You're exactly right. You're right. Because to me, everything is based on thought processes. And there are many people who say, oh, well, the actions are your thoughts, your actions are what come from your actions. Your thoughts come from your actions. Excuse me.
No. Your actions are a follow-through of what you or community think.
Exactly.
So if one person, they have an example, one person hate, you can fill a football stadium of all people who hate and direct it at the 1 or 2 people standing down on the field, and you can kill them.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Very well put. Exactly. My thought process is on that. Until we reach, these are my words of wisdom, and this is what I try to bring forth in an American Story. This kind of wisdom. We have to reach the height of wisdom. If we don't, we will painstakingly wallow in the ills of the flesh, imposing our beliefs on others while seeking to control and govern them. Your family will remain my family. Your nation will mimic my nation. And we will all continue in the pathway of destruction. But today is a new day, a day we can begin the journey. Human history cannot be altered. It may explain us, but it doesn't define us. What can be altered is human intelligence replaced with divine intelligence. And divine intelligence means elevating and pushing your thought outside of the realm of human belief or mortal belief, and identifying with the truth discovered by prophets and lived by the greatest man who walked the face of the earth, in my opinion, and that man was Jesus. How do we move forward? How do we help develop a worldwide family that the one Father knows and created? I believe the answers lie in Matthew 6:33. And that seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all things will be added unto you.
And on that note, we'll wrap it up for this interview with Dr. Mamie Smith, the lady who wrote An American Story, My Family and Yours. And you can listen to this interview on Cool Your Heels with Lillian on amfm247.com every Tuesday evening from 8 to 9 p.m. Go over to amfm247.com /Lillian Cauldwell and you can hear this interview. You can also hear it on https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. Right-hand side, a menu, scroll down, come to Cool Your Hills, click on it, and it will be there. Not technologically savvy? No problem. Use the sizzle line. We provide you with a phone number, dial it, and listen to the interview. Also heard on iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, Radio.co, also on ALEXA. Before you go away and stray, G.K. Chesterton had this to say in 1905. We ought to see far enough into a hypocrite to see even his sincerity. Thank you all very much for listening, and until next time, please keep listening. Thank you.